Now, negotiators from around the world are meeting in the western German city of Bonn this week for UN climate talks. One of the goals is to hash out the details of a new fund that's intended to pay for loss and damage experienced by poorer nations due to climate change. The meeting comes as wealthy nations prepare to outline their plans to tackle the global climate crisis.
Heavy rain and severe flooding. More than 1,500 people died as part of extreme floods in Pakistan in 2022. The disaster is estimated to have caused around $30 billion in economic losses and damage. Climate change likely increased rainfall intensity by around 50%, according to a study. And it's also having an impact elsewhere. Heat waves and droughts are becoming more likely and lasting longer, storms more intense. The economic toll is on the rise. In 2021, economic damage caused by natural disasters hit more than $250 billion. Some estimates say that costs from loss and damage caused by climate change in developing countries alone could reach $1.8 trillion by 2050.
Today, here in Sharm el-Sheikh,
Last year, developed nations agreed to set up funding to help Global South countries cope with the financial impact of climate change-related losses at the International Climate Summit in Egypt. But as talks kick off this week in Bonn, it's clear there will be tensions.
It all comes down to money. There's a sense in some of the developed countries that the finance available for international solidarity is limited. We're seeing a cost of living crisis globally, thanks to skyrocketing energy prices, the hangovers from the COVID pandemic. And that's making all of these conversations about money and how to fund climate action even more fraught.
Countries in the global north will also be coming under pressure as they prepare to reveal how far they have come with goals to reduce carbon emissions. It's part of a global stocktake that will be given during the next International Climate Summit, COP28, in the United Arab Emirates in November. Experts say there will be no surprises.
It's going to say we're not on track to keeping global warming below 2 degrees, let alone keeping it to below 1.5 degrees. So we need to see a strong and robust response from governments at COP28 on what they're going to do to close those gaps.
The Bonn talks will serve as little comfort to the people in Pakistan still recovering from last year's flooding. But behind the scenes, delegates will be hoping to hammer out technical details that move richer nations closer to action. Solid commitments, though, will likely have to wait for world leaders to take the stage later in the year.
And DW's climate reporter Louise Osborne, who filed that report, joins me now in the studio. Hi there, Louise. Tell us what's on the agenda for this conference, these talks in Bonn.
So this is a technical conference that is going to lay the groundwork for COP28 that's coming later this year. So it will be looking at the nitty-gritty behind the bigger decisions that will be heard then. They'll be looking at loss and damage, which is a kind of compensation for developing countries that are feeling the worst of the climate crisis. They will then also be looking at this thing called the global stocktake. Now, this is very important. It's the first time that it's happened since the Paris Agreement. And it's looking at the measures that countries are taking to try to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and whether they're enough. It's going to find that they're not enough. And it's just a question then of seeing whether countries are going to make bigger commitments to try and move forward later in the year at this bigger conference.
Now, the last UN climate conference, the COP27, agreed on a loss and damage fund to support poorer nations, didn't it? So can you explain to us why climate compensation is still such a sticking point?
So they agreed that there should be a fund, but they didn't agree on how that is going to look. And that is what they're going to be talking about. So the loss and damage deals with the impacts that developing countries particularly are feeling as a part of the climate change crisis. And it's developed countries, that would be then paying money towards those developing countries as the ones that have actually contributed to the CO2 being in the atmosphere in the first place. One of the sticking points is that developed countries think that China, as the biggest emitter, should also be paying into this fund. But actually, China is not a historical emitter. The EU or Europe and the US have contributed more CO2 over time. And so the question is whether China should be contributing or not, and then also looking at who should be receiving that money and how that's going to be calculated.
OK, so still lots of details to be worked out there. I've got to ask you about the United Arab Emirates, a huge oil exporter and host of COP28, so the next UN climate conference. Surely that will impact negotiations.
That's right. Well, the COP president is actually the CEO of the nation's oil and gas company, which is one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, even. And that is going to have an impact for sure. I mean, this president is supposed to be a neutral party in the talks, and people are questioning how that can be the case when he is obviously in this position. There is also going to be some criticism generally of being in the United Arab Emirates as a state that is not allowing protest and those kinds of things. There is also, I mean, the United Arab Emirates itself has actually said that, they want to see big oil take a place at the table to be involved in this talk. The problem is that they are calling for emissions to be lowered rather than fossil fuel phase out, which is what the UN wants to see. And these emissions will then, could be taken by carbon capture, for example, as a technology. But this technology has not been proven at scale. And so there are going to be different ways that they're going to have to get through this. But it is definitely controversial that they are holding the talks.
Controversial, absolutely. Louise Osborne from DW Environment, thank you.